Hello, everyone. This is David Bryant, songwriter and entrepreneur, and I'd like to welcome you to three of the most influential decades in music history: the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. This is brought to you by Who Influenced You. Who Influenced You is a YouTube web series and community for the topic of influence. It was created and it's hosted by Lorelai McBroom, a singer-songwriter, someone I've known as a personal friend, and we've collaborated over the years for over 35 years now. Lorelai sang with Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones, Rod Stewart. She's really got a lot of experience out there, and she had this idea to create Who Influenced You, to talk about influences. It came from the time she was out on the road with Rod Stewart, and he was doing a Sam Cooke song, and Sam Cooke is the biggest influence on Rod Stewart. You can go look it up. He talks about it all the time. So she had the idea, hey, let's, start a series and do interviews. And that's what she's been doing. So if you enjoy this video, hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll see a lot of the episodes that Lorelai's done. And we really appreciate your support. So let's go ahead on and get started with this. The 60s, the 70s, and 80s. Man, I was born in the 60s, grew up in my early years in the 70s, and then went on to become a successful songwriter in the 80s. And I can tell you, these particular music artists that we're going to talk about, and just the decades in general, really shaped and influenced what I ended up being as a songwriter as well as a person. And I think that's really important to state, that these 3 decades really had a big impact on the world in many different ways, not just in music, but in society as well. So let's start with the men. And I've picked out 3 different sets here of men. Let's start with the first one in the upper right-hand corner representing the 60s. That's Jimi Hendrix and Mick Jagger. I mean, they were huge. And this was during a time period in the 60s when a transition was happening in society. When you think, at least here in the United States, it was happening. If you think about the 50s and then you think about the 60s, there was a big change. And these 2 guys were a big part of it, with rock and roll music, just bringing that in, one from the United States, one from the UK, the influence that it had on society, the hippies, free love, electric guitars, like all of those things were brand new. And these 2 were right at the center of it. And they're legends. These are legends. Jimi Hendrix on guitar is just admired by so many guitar players. He was so free spirited. And Mick Jagger, he's out there at over 70 years old and he's still touring with the Rolling Stones. It's incredible, the kind of stamina and the strength and the longevity that Mick has had. I always talk to Lorelai about it because she sang with the Rolling Stones. And I just go, I don't know how Mick does it. But she said he's on a regimen, nutritionally right. He's not partying the way that he might have earlier on in his career. So look at Mick. He's out there still doing it. And that's something for any of you young people, young musicians who might be listening to this. The beauty of music is you can do this for your whole entire life, regardless of whether or not you're trying to do it professionally or just as a hobby, whatever it might be. Music is universal and it's something that's built within people. So if you're a musician or a songwriter or somebody out there, just keep being you, keep creating, because it's a really beautiful thing. Now let's go to the 70s. Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney. Remember the song Ebony and Ivory? Great song, but both of them individually, obviously Paul coming from the Beatles and Stevie being this young protege from the time he was 11 years old in Motown, and just what he ended up doing in the 70s with Songs in the Key of Life and so many other things that he did, so admired by so many people. But here's the beauty of it. Both of their songs impacted people's lives. That's one thing I want to get across with this. Even though we interview musicians and people in the music industry, as well as other people like actors and actresses, like Marla Gibbs is one of the interviews in YouTube on Who Influenced You. It's about like impacting society, the world. Music is universal, and these 2 are the best examples of it. I mean, all over the world, absolutely legendary, completely special. Nobody liked them, and they had a big influence in the 70s. Paul, obviously, and Stevie started in the 60s, but they really came into their own individually after the Beatles, obviously, with Paul, but Stevie just always by himself. in the 70s. So a big part of the 70s. And then let's go to the 80s. That's the the decade where I started doing my professional songwriting. And we've got two big ones there just to show the example, Prince and Michael Jackson. A lot of young people will talk to me and say, like we love Bruno Mars and we love Taylor Swift and we love Adele and we love, Coldplay and whoever it might be. Absolutely wonderful. Every generation has their own heroes. Paul Simon had a line in one of his songs. He said, "Every generation throws a hero up the pop charts." If you take that literally, he's right on point. Every generation has those people who they admire and love their music. But these 3 decades were foundational pieces to the 90s, the thousands, the tens, and now the 20s. These three foundational decades set the tone for contemporary music in all genres. So that's the reason why I wanted to start with the 60s, 70s, 80s. We'll touch on the 90s and other decades as we go, but really important. And those are two of the biggest, influencers. Michael, the biggest in the world by some people. Prince, one of the most innovative musicians, songwriters, completely different, had his own unique style. And they were both giants, absolute giants in the 80s. All right, so let's go to the other side of the fence. Let's talk about the women. Woo! Look at there. Janis Joplin and Aretha Franklin. Does it get any better than that? Absolutely not. A lot of surveys have said that Aretha gets voted as the greatest singer of all time. I wouldn't argue with that. She influenced so many musicians, so many people in the public absolutely love her. Her music gives a feeling, a sense of empowerment with respect, and just the way she sings soulfully with gospel influences. And Janis was one of a kind too. Nobody had the voice like Janis. If you listen to Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, you're going to hear a lot of that kind of a feeling of the way the vocals are strong, that screaming energy that Janis had that was all coming from her heart. And it's unfortunate that many of them in that era, in the 60s especially, were doing drugs, and those things caught up with a lot of people. Jim Morrison, Hendrix, Janis. It was just the era, and they were influenced by the culture, which was loaded with drugs and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? But Janis was an original. There's been nobody like her since. Her soul, the way she sang, and Aretha is the queen of soul, right? So those two in the 60s and women. And now let's go to the 70s. How about Donna Summer and Joni Mitchell? Two completely different artists, right? Donna with the disco era. Look at how big her influence was in that huge era. And then Joni as a singer songwriter in that style that was lyrical and talking about certain subjects. Taylor Swift absolutely lists Joni Mitchell as one of her biggest influences. Think about that. Taylor Swift is out there right now with her Eras tour, making over $100 million because in this generation there's a lot of money, right? But she was influenced as one of her influences by Joni Mitchell, a storyteller in the 70s, particularly. She really, really shared a lot of her powerful songs with the public. And, she's an artist, she's a painter, creative people. Creative people inspire the whole world. There's a certain gift that certain people have that rise to this level. Everybody that I'm going to talk about here is absolutely at the top of music, and they had a huge impact on people and society. So that's the reason why we wanted to do 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now let's get to the 80s. Woo! Madonna. Madonna said she was going to capture the world. She was going to rule the world, and she sure did in the 80s. She became the biggest female music superstar in the world. She put the hard work in. And what was really interesting is Madonna wasn't the most talented singer, right? But she had a persona of an artist that impacted people, that could get people to dress a certain way, act a certain way. She had a persona, and she still does to this day, even though she's in her 60s now. Not as much of an impact as when she was in her prime in the 80s, but boy, did she have an impact on young girls all over the world with her songs, with her fashion, with her trends, with her attitude. And then there was Whitney, who some people say are right. Is some people say Whitney's the greatest singer of all time. Whitney, even though I wrote a song for you called Moment of Truth, I did write a song for Whitney Houston. Aretha is still number one. And you know the reason why? Because Aretha influenced you. You said it, it's the truth. Aretha came before you. You listened to Aretha, that helped to influence you, along with your mother, Cissy Houston, and many others. But you became one of the hugest stars in the world. Vocally, who could really compete with you in the 80s? I mean, there was Mariah Carey coming in the 90s and Celine Dion who came after you. You influenced them, but you were really dominating in the 80s, especially the second half of the 80s. Madonna had the middle and into the second half and on into the 90s, and Whitney into the 90s. So those two women really had a big impact on people, especially with the power of the songs and material. Madonna, not the greatest singer, but had hit songs that really had stories and dance songs and everything like that. And Whitney with the most incredible voice that people just say, wow, she was an angel. Unfortunate that, she's not here anymore, but boy, it was amazing when she was, right? And she's still here because music lingers on in the recordings. All right, so now let's move on to bands. How about this? The Beatles. That's an obvious in the 60s, right? They dominated in the 60s. And Paul and John were just incredible together as songwriters. And you just the whole thing that they brought was brand new. It was fresh, but they were influenced by, listen to this, by Little Richard, by Sam Cooke, by Motown. That's who influenced them. So this is the reason why in the 60s you had all these artists influencing each other who then influenced the world, the general public, the fans with music. And then if you go to the 70s, my favorite band of all time, Earth, Wind and Fire. I actually started my professional songwriting career with Al McKay, the rhythm guitar player for Earth, Wind and Fire for many years. When he left the band, he started a new group with young people. I was one of the songwriters in that camp, and we wrote songs for a lot of big music artists. But I'll tell you, Earth, Wind and Fire took it to another level. Any of you younger people who haven't really zeroed in on Earth, Wind and Fire, I highly encourage you to do that. Not only was it commercial, meaning it was easy and simple for the public to understand, with songs like September and Sing a Song. And Al and Maurice wrote Best of My Love for the Emotions. That was a number one hit. But the musicality, the musicianship, the band, the whole chemistry, and then the positive message that Maurice put across with the energy of what he was trying to portray Earth, Wind, and Fire to be. Shining star. You're a shining star no matter who you are, shining bright to see what you can truly be. Imagine hearing that in the 70s and feeling empowered. That's the influence of music artists. And moving into the 80s, probably the biggest band in the 80s was U2. Bono, Edge, and the guys just absolutely blew up. They became like as big as the Stones were in the 60s and 70s. They became like the 80s band globally, selling out arenas and stadiums worldwide. And still to this day, having a positive impact with causes, like charitable causes and global causes and world issues, always at the forefront of that. So that's their influence, not just musically, but also society wise. Musicians and bands can do that. So yeah, U2 was definitely it in the 80s and beyond, but the 80s was when they started and had that foundation going. And now finally, I wanted to put in this category because everything starts with a song. I'm a songwriter. Lorelai's a songwriter. But these folks right here, top of the line in every decade, starting in the 60s. Now, you also, just before I do this, you also had Lennon and McCartney, the Beatles, right? They definitely were top songwriters in the 60s, but they were also music artists. So this is just songwriting for three of these guys, Holland, Dozier, Holland, the sound, the writing, and the dominant force behind the songs for Motown in the 60s. Motown completely influenced the world. And not only just them, all the other artists, but one of the top artists as a songwriter, as a storyteller at that time was Smokey Robinson. And I have to say, it's really amazing for me personally to go through this list because I actually wrote a song for a Smokey as well. I'm not trying to just toot my horn or anything. I'm just going, how did this happen for me? I think it's because I was listening to this type of music growing up in the 60s, in the 70s. And then when it came my time to actually be a songwriter in the 80s, I was able to have some of these folks record my songs and work with some of the top producers in the industry. So the influence that this group had on me personally, had on Lorelei, had on many of our friends who went on to become successful is absolutely phenomenal. So these are the songwriters. And then when we move in the 70s, not only were these guys songwriters, but they were music artists at the top of the game. And that's Billy Joel and Elton John. Piano playing songwriters with some of the greatest music, some of the greatest songs in the history of music. They both complemented each other. They both toured with each other at some point, but they just dominated in the pop era when they were doing their piano pop songs that were going out on the charts and out in the world. And then great musicians, phenomenal musicians and bands that they had with them together that were really, really powerful. I mean, some of my favorite songs came from Billy Joel and from Elton John. As a matter of fact, my favorite Billy Joel song is Honesty. What an amazing song. And for me personally, with Elton John, it's I'm Still Standing. The empowerment lyric of that and the groove of that and how powerful that is. Listen to that when you're feeling down and see if it doesn't influence you to feel a little bit better. And finally, 80s songwriters. Those are two of the biggest ones. Lionel Richie, did he dominate with the ballads? I mean, how many ballads did he have that the whole world was singing, especially for the ladies? They absolutely loved all those ballads that Lionel wrote coming from the Commodores in the 70s and then into the 80s. Unbelievable. And then my personal friend and Lorelei's personal friend, Diane Warren. I actually wrote 4 songs with Diane that got recorded. She's gone on to become one of the biggest songwriters in the history of music. So prolific, so many different songs. You would know them. Unbreak My Heart, Because You Love Me, Don't Want to Miss a Thing. Just so many songs. I could just go on and on for so many different artists. She's still doing it now. 13 Oscar nominations. And she started off just like other people who are in music, started off in her little cave writing her songs. Her father was her biggest fan. He got her guitar and took her to the songwriting events when she was young. Her mother wasn't the biggest supporter, but her father was. And he's the one that kind of supported her, and she rolled with it. And look at what happened. She's gone on to become Hall of Fame and legendary with some of the most amazing songs that people absolutely love and still doing it to this day. So the songwriters are really important because everything starts with a song. And then you have your bands where you have a collective of musicians, you have your male artists and female artists. They all come together and they came out of different eras, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which laid a foundation for the music that came after it. And here's a final note. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I like to talk about the artists in that era. You really had to be able to do what was important: write songs. You had to be able to perform those songs live. You had to be able to have a personality on recording so that radio would pick you up. Or if you were a rock band, you had to have a certain persona as a rock band, or even an R&B band like Earth, Wind, and Fire. That was what was required back then. Now, a lot of things are more synthesized. You can do recording on a laptop. You don't even need to have a bunch of people in the studio to record or play instruments. So these people had to learn their craft, had to do it organically, didn't have any devices in a major way to help them, and became the foundation of influence musically for other musicians and singers and songwriters, and also for fans all over the world. Go and ask somebody who was born in those eras, who grew up listening to those songs. To this day, they can go back and reflect. And the same thing is going to happen in this era, because I can bet you 30 years from now, there's going to be a bunch of Taylor Swift fans, the Swifties, that are going to go, oh my gosh, when I was 20 and 30 years old, Taylor Swift was my hero. And that's the way music works, because music is one of the most influential things in the world. So again, we all have influences. Who influenced you? We would like to know. Join our community, be a part of what we're doing. Lorelai has created something wonderful here. I'm part of the team, part of the group, part of the community. And I encourage you, if you're a songwriter or a fan, or you just love to hear stories, watch those episodes. There's a lot of stuff you can learn from that. And we're going to be continuing to make these episodes for you guys and hope that you'll enjoy them and make these little clips that talk about the history of music and things like that. So thanks for taking the time to listen. We wish you all the best in whatever you're trying to do musically or just as a fan. And as always, stay positive, think positive, be positive. Have a wonderful day.